my presentation, which is on 2 sides. I always hope it's going to work out. It's a bit confused and ambivalent, and in a sense what I'm going to talk about I feel a little confused and ambivalent about. This is probably one of my last days in Limerick. Tomorrow will be the last day after 7 years of working here. And thinking about what John said, in terms of some of the work that I've done, I've come to understand the colonial logics of the city in the ways in which there's a sort of centre ground in thinking that positions some as others, and those others feel as though there's society and there's us. They sometimes talk about the segregated, this is some of the men I've worked with in my classes, the segregated ways in which the city operates and the kinds of invisible barriers. A little like Phelan, who is a thinker that a lot of people that I've worked with doing my philosophy classes, his words resonate with them, in that the eye of the often middle-class person simply freezes somebody into an identity by virtue of the way they look, the fact that they're wearing a hoodie, the way that they talk. So in a way, I want to keep that in mind in terms of thinking about colonial logics, colonial mentalities, and a kind of centrist thinking, as I go through some of the ideas that really, like I say, are, and it's a really weird place to be. I feel like I'm stage fright. I feel like I should be performing in a place like this when I'm talking into the darkness. It's a very peculiar way of trying to have a dialogue around contemporary questions. So, unfortunately, philosophy doesn't make you happy, so it's not going to be, I'm hoping Luke Gibbons is going to have a resounding, joyous finale, because in a sense, this isn't one of those. I guess what I'm trying to do is think through my own story in some respects, in terms of the kinds of things that have occupied me, the kinds of topics I've thought about, and what I've tried to avoid and remain silent about. And in a way, there's a kind of navigating colonial remains in that respect. So when I think about, the kinds of things that I was interested in, even in college, I did a thesis, an undergraduate dissertation on the responsible assimilationist policy of the Canadian government, talking with Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people on the eastern coast of Canada. I lived in El Salvador as well, and there, of course, understanding not only the legacies of Euromodernity, but also trying to think through the legacies of the ways in which colonial frameworks persist through free trade agreements and free trade zones that allow for particularly exploitative forms of labour. I worked with a friend of mine who's Mizo in northeast India, which some of you will know is a tribal area. What I think I've studiously tried to do is not look at Ireland and not talk about Ireland and not think about Ireland, and think about the questions of the colonial in lots of spaces beyond this island. And I think there's something interesting about my feeling of incompetence, ambivalence, and the difficulty of talking about colonialism on this island. There's obviously, as Caoimhín was talking about, questions of complicity, collaboration, and so on, the kind of ambivalent relation to colonialism that Ireland's had in terms of imperialist ventures. But as Mary was saying, we've also got the ships full of emigrants, many destined to die, which mimic in some ways the other ships crossing the Atlantic. The difficulty is also your past speaks through you, even with how one names things. So I spent 5 years teaching philosophy in Republican landings. On one particular Republican landing, it was just really, I realised how difficult it is to even speak about colonialism in Ireland, because no matter what you say, you're giving away a whole history, your unconscious or implicit allegiances, the ways that you feel situated. So we'd have conversations about the 6 counties, couldn't call it the Northern Ireland, north of Ireland, 6 counties, occupied 6 counties. I was like, no, I'm not going to go there. 26 counties, Free State, and what the most recent rendition was Roy, or the Republic of Ireland. But so the ways in which we name and speak about the island also betray so much. And I think that's something, again, that I felt a certain difficulty in terms of turning to think about the question of colonialism here. So earlier, we were talking about is, is there the post-colonial? And of course there's been so many debates in Ireland about whether or not we were colonial. Was it not a kind of protectorate, in some sense, part of the Union, so not really like other colonies. The question of whether we're post-colonial, of course, raises its head again with the Brexit vote and the questions about how one sees the island, and questions of unification, question of partition as well. And I guess I find that there's so many things that one can't talk about here. But one of the things that I'm interested in thinking through is this question now, if we are going to take seriously some of the conversations that have been had here and think about how colonial logics operate, for someone like Enrique Dussel, who, of course, others know far better than me, for the Argentinian philosopher, he would ask us to ask the question, not just who are the Irish, and I think we should be doing that, who counts as Irish, who's seen as Irish, but where is Ireland? Do we regard ourselves in the centre or the periphery? And there is something about the forms of thinking that have emerged from Latin America and elsewhere that I think are instructive in terms of getting us to reflect on and dismantle colonial logics, including those sort of centrist logics of the middle class, speaking about disadvantage in Moyross and South Hill and Weston and so on in Limerick, the ways in which certain populations are othered. So I want to think about that kind of what happens when you position yourself at the centre. So where is Ireland? Do we regard ourselves at the periphery? Do we regard ourselves at the centre? And what difference does that make? So I ask that because of the ways in which participating in colonial thinking and practices can sustain the enactment and extension and embodiment of that legacy. So part of this is around trying to navigate complicity, trying to think about our own role in empire's civilizing missions, in the Christianity civilizing missions as well. And I think one of the particular complexities in terms of colonialism is the ways in which the Irish have navigated their whiteness. So Zeus Leonardo writes a little bit about this, thinking of it from an educational perspective, but how one negotiates one's way out of one's whiteness, because this is where a particular ambivalence lies. Because in many respects, in more recent times, that the white supremacist ideology persists in terms of the raciological frameworks that continue to structure our planet. So again, it's a little too easy to position oneself on the side of the colonized if one isn't prepared to reflect on the ways in which not only one's a net beneficiary of perceived whiteness, but also the ways in which one's complicit with practices that sustain that. I'm going to talk a little bit about Enrique Dussel's work. And again, these are my mangled notes, so you'll have to forgive my meandering. And then I'm going to read a little bit from a piece that I've read from before that I always get really nervous about because it shows my complete naivety as somebody from Dublin and from the south. So Enrique Dussel, in a way, is discomforting because of the ways in which I think we're forced to think about our centrist mentality, perhaps, and the ways in which, for me as a philosopher, European philosophy has always situated itself as universal. There's a certain moment in Philosophy of Liberation where he speaks about what a barbarian philosophy might be like. And the idea is that so many people have been constituted as other, as unable to speak. Linda Smith says, we do not yet think. So the kinds of manners in which people are silenced, and we can call it epistemic injustice, we could call it hermeneutical and testimonial injustice, that some people are listened to and seen to embody the universal, and others are situated as having alternative knowledges, as having indigenous knowledges and so on, but not as participating in the universal. So when I was doing my Viva, and this is where the joy came in, I think I did used to be quite joyous. I was studying Spinoza and Deleuze, and I had my PhD Viva was with Paul Gilroy. And he asked me, after my joyous exposition of, if anyone's read Spinoza and Deleuze, you'll know I was really happy in a sense of reimagining the human. And then he asked me if I'd read Enrique Dussel. And I hadn't. And in fact, there was only one book in translation at that time, which was The Underside of Modernity. A number of the others have been translated since, but I spent a few years trying to, in a sense, cobble together an understanding of his position. And I think it's one of the things that I probably haven't sufficiently reflected on still in terms of how that, which we spoke about earlier, the colonial modernity framework continues to structure our thinking and our imaginings. So we haven't yet begun to decolonize the mind, and we haven't yet to decolonize the imaginary. So he speaks about that underside of modernity that Catalina spoke about. The underside of modernity being the conditions for modernity were expropriation, mass rape, genocide, enslavement. These are not factors that are accidental to the process, mere, as so many people say, just these anomalies of history. This, for somebody like Dussel, and I think we need to take this seriously, this is what makes modernity possible. So he suggests that we need to consider the ways in which, from the colonizing of the Americas, the ways in which the ego cogito of Descartes is preceded by the ego, the conquering ego. In other words, the figure that positions itself as the universal, this kind of imperial ego that sees the earth as a terra nullius, that it can invade and appropriate. And this is followed for Dussel by Descartes' ego, which in a sense founds itself, and I don't want to be unfair to Descartes here, being a philosopher, but we'll just work with this imagery. Through a process of doubting, comes to this kind of center point of certainty. And this, again, thinking about this question of architecture and the spatial logics at play, it is this idea that we need to even move beyond the sort of progress models that we're familiar with in terms of the civilizing process, but the ways in which these spatial logics, these spatial colonial logics persist. Who has the truth? Who can speak? Who's seen as somebody who's speaking from a particular perspective? Now, anyone in feminist philosophy knows, in terms of the claims to universality of a particular kind of male, it's a raced male, it's a middle-class male. So we're familiar with that kind of a discourse. But the ways in which so many forms of speaking and knowing are simply dismissed as, one could say, barbaric. For somebody like Dussel, it is about how do we create a kind of barbarian philosophy that doesn't begin with the self-centeredness and self-certainty of the center, but rather with the periphery. So not this hegemonic imperial self that is contented with itself, prepared to allow for assimilationist gestures, but rather to think about another kind of philosophy. And here he says a barbarian philosophy is a philosophy of liberation, but it's also about liberating philosophy. Read a little bit about this. Busi Bulaga talks about the dominator-dominated opposition being replicated in a number of spheres. So again, what I want you to just keep in mind is colonial logics and how they operate, and the ways in which certain people are seen as speaking from a position of particularity rather than universality, and the ways in which such discourses are silenced or simply not heard and not listened to. And there's so much terrific work that seeks to undo that kind of self-certainty of that model. So Bulaga says that everything begins when the Muntu, the African human being, experiences the drowning of her word, submerged in insignificance, in the possibility of that which does not signify. This happens when she speaks, but cannot make herself understood, like an animal that grunts or a barbarian that stutters. The Muntu is aware of what's happened, of the violence of history, of what the violence of history has made of her. She knows the uselessness of apology, and through that of abstract universality. She won't convince anyone through discussion, or even make herself seriously heard, because of what has been denied and robbed from her is her language. She's just a barbarian. Another philosopher, James Tully, writes in his book, Strange Multiplicity, how can the proponents of recognition, and we think here of the European philosophers like Habermas and Karl Otto Appel and so on, how can the proponents of recognition bring forth their claims in a public forum in which their cultures have been excluded or demeaned for centuries? They can accept the authoritarian language in institutions, in which case their claims are rejected by conservatives or comprehended by progressives within the very language and institutions whose sovereignty and impartiality they question. Or they can refuse to play the game, in which case they become marginal and reluctant conscripts, or they can take up arms. But nobody wants this tragic battle that covers the common ground of so many contemporary societies with the scars of battle. So I'm just going to read a little bit from this for the last couple of minutes. And keeping in mind this idea of strange multiplicity, the ways in which people's voices are silenced, delegitimated, again what Miranda Fricker calls epistemic injustice, and as well of the violence of colonial logics, that Dussel says, really, I mean, as philosophers, you know, if we're going to be critical philosophers, we should be thinking from the position of if somebody says, I'm hungry, the world needs to transform itself. The institutions, the mechanisms of trade and so on would need to be transformed in order for that appeal to be heard. In other words, if we were to change the conditions, the living conditions for so much of humanity, the kinds of transformations that are required are not just at the level of discursiveness. So, this is my really naive bit of being a Southern person, as I say, coming from Dublin. Gave this talk in Derry a while ago. So, before any conversation can take place, one must feel as though one can speak. One can feel silenced in so many ways, and yet silence has many qualities. That borderline that runs like a blind drawing across fields and lakes doesn't easily allow for an occupation of the spaces between, the interstice, or any of those other metaphors to which I'm ordinarily attracted, because they disturb the logic of identity. William James once said that relations are external to their terms. He said relations are real, but sometimes I feel as though the border, partition, makes any relationship between terms incommensurable. The south becomes anywhere that is not north, including the inlets and bogs at the far reaches of Donegal. So when I say, and I talk about a southern question, I don't want to default to the language of we and they, reinforcing the logic of boundaries, but only to say something about the silence of the south, of so many of my contemporaries and predecessors who behave, to use the image of Kevin Barry, the Limerick writer, in the city of Logan, as though all that was beyond that squiggledy border line was the big nothing. So there's a first sense that this silence, that and speaking for myself, the refusal to think about the North, the refusal to think about colonial Ireland, other than in those kind of monumental commemorative glorifications of 1916, and I'm speaking just for myself here, but I know it resonates with some others. This silence, I thought initially might come from a volatile mixture of shame and the kind of shamelessness that takes the form of indifference or insensibility. So Charles Mills calls this willed ignorance. Primo Levi says something of the same, the refusal to see, the refusal to perceive, the turning away. So in a sense, a shame that's political. And this is what Marx calls revolutionary, that shame that paralyzes and provokes us and perplexes us. And that kind of a shame can reveal our collective responsibility for the deeds of the past, the deeds of our ancestors, as well as the deeds of the present. But I'm not sure it's this shame of which I speak. So the undergoing of which I speak ends with what Primo Levi calls the shame of being human. It's not an act of will. If not seeing is a way of not knowing, then seeing of what's intolerable or refusing to see what was there brings a flood of shame. So this other kind of shame involves a painful realization that we have been indifferent to the suffering of others, even if there was little that we could do. And that shame reveals how we're bound to and by others. It's political because it extends its imaginary beyond kin and that illegitimate extension of family bonds that's in the imaginary of the nation state. That shame might come to involve some acknowledgement that the South is not innocent of complicity and suffering, not just because of Garda collusion or support of physical force republicanism, and not even because the fate of the North was bound up with the original act of partition, which eventually constituted the Republic, but because the political imaginary of the South has remained so impoverished and narrow, so insensitive to its othering impulses, and so unwilling to find forms of solidarity other than those rooted in a dominant identitarian politic. I'm going to finish on that one.